Hello, everyone. There are more people coming in. Please have a seat. We're just about to begin. So hello again, my name is Andrei Baikov, and you haven't come to see me. I would like to introduce to you our honored guest. It's Professor John Mearsheimer. For those of you who missed his first talk on Monday, I'd like to give a brief introduction, very brief because most of you are aware of the credentials of Professor John Mearsheimer. Right, so Dr. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science of the University of Chicago. He was trained at West Point from 1966 to 1970, and he earned his master's degree in the University of Southern California and his PhD in the Cornell University. He's been working at the University of Chicago since 1982. He's well known as the main proponent of and the author of the offensive realism strand within the School of Political Science of Political Realism. He's written scores of influential articles and books, just to name only a few: Conventional Deterrence, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, The Israel Lobby and the US Foreign Policy, and Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics. He's given already 2 talks at MGIMO University, one on why China cannot rise peacefully, the other one, the Middle Eastern policy of the US, and today is going to be about the Ukraine crisis. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you ask your provocative questions. Please be advised that Professor Mearsheimer will have to leave straight after the end of the lecture, so please pose your questions very briefly, be to the point, so that as many people as possible can ask their questions. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming Professor John Mearsheimer.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thanks to everybody for coming out. It's amazing to think that I've given 3 successive lectures, and in each case, the lecture hall has gotten bigger and bigger. And I'm actually honored that so many people would turn out on a Friday evening to hear me speak. The subject, of course, is the causes and consequences of the Ukraine crisis. And the way I'd like to proceed is I'd like to make a number of preliminary comments, and then I'd like to talk about what I think are the causes of the conflict, and then talk about what is the conventional wisdom on what caused this crisis between the United States and Russia, or Russia and the West more generally. And as almost all of you know, I believe that the conflict was mainly caused by Western policy, not by the actions of Putin or Russia more generally, which is the conventional wisdom, at least in the West. Then I'd like to talk about the West's response to the crisis and its inadequacies, and then what should be done, and then what are the consequences of this crisis. So that's the order in which I'll proceed. Let me start off with some comments about this subject. This is a radioactive subject. I've dealt with a lot of different security issues over the years, and there are not many issues that are as controversial, certainly in the West, but I think between the West and Russia, as the Ukraine crisis and the question of who's responsible for it. In the West, if you blame the United States and its allies, you're accused of defending Putin, and it's almost like you're unpatriotic. So it's almost a no-no for any American or European to argue that the Russians did not cause the Ukraine crisis. I would argue that there are probably 3 or 4, maybe 4 or 5 other people in the United States who share my views on what caused this crisis. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that it's just politically incorrect, if not politically intolerable in the West, to argue that the West is largely responsible for the crisis. I think the argument that people like me are defending Putin is a foolish argument. I think it's very important that we understand who is responsible for causing this problem. And who is responsible is largely determined by examining the facts. There's a certain set of facts surrounding this crisis. And what you have to do for yourself is you have to examine the facts. And you have to see whether you think my argument is correct or whether you think the conventional wisdom is correct. I personally believe that this is an open shut case. It's one of the simplest cases I've ever seen. I think it's unequivocally clear, at least in my mind, that the West is responsible for causing this crisis. The second thing I'd like to do is I'd like to lay out the basic geopolitical map that I have in my head about this crisis. This is a map that helps me think about the Ukraine crisis. This is a map of Europe today, pretty straightforward map. But to make sense of that map and think about European security, I think this is a good way to conceptualize the issue. I start with France on the far left, go to Germany, go to Poland, go to Ukraine, and go to Russia. When you think about security in Europe, those are the 5 countries that matter the most. And in modern times, the 2 countries that have mattered the most for European security are Germany and Russia, which is why they're outlined in red. And what matters really greatly is what countries are between Germany and Russia, or whether or not there are any countries between Russia and Germany. You all know that before World War I in 1914, there was no Ukraine, independent Ukraine, there was no independent Poland, and Russia and Germany abutted each other. That was not true before World War II. So it's very important to think about Germany on one hand and Russia on the other hand, and what's in between. And much of the thinking about the Ukraine crisis revolves around that basic geographical schema. Okay, let me now turn to the causes of the conflict. And I'm going to give you John's view on what caused the Ukrainian crisis. First of all, you have to talk about the deep causes. What are the underlying causes behind this situation? Then you have to talk about the precipitating cause. What caused the crisis to happen in February of 2014? And then finally, we have to talk about the Russian reaction. So what I'm going to do, in terms of laying out my views on the causes of the conflict, is talk about the deep cause, the precipitating cause, and the Russian reaction. Starting with the deep cause. My argument is that the deep cause of the crisis was the aim of the United States and its European allies to peel Ukraine away from the Soviet orbit and incorporate it into the West. And this policy actually had 3 dimensions to it: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and fostering an orange revolution. And as you all know, when I say fostering an orange revolution, I'm talking about promoting democracy in Ukraine. So the strategy that the West comes up with for peeling Ukraine away from Russia's orbit has 3 elements, and these are the 3 elements. And what we want to do is go through each one of those elements, starting, of course, with NATO expansion, which I think is the most important of the 3. Sorry. Here's a map of the eastward expansion of NATO. NATO expansion becomes a hot topic in the United States in the mid-1990s. It's the Clinton administration that's in the White House, and the Clinton administration is very interested in NATO expansion. There's huge opposition to it inside the United States at the time, but those in favor of expansion win. And the first tranche of expansion takes place in 1999. And as a result of that tranche, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary are admitted to NATO. That's the first tranche. It's important to understand that the Soviets made it clear that they were adamantly opposed to that expansion. Then there's another expansion in 2004. And if you look at the map, you'll see that that expansion includes the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. They all come in 2004. The Soviets complain bitterly about that second tranche, but they don't do anything. Then, very importantly, you have the Bucharest Summit in April of 2008. And at the end of that summit, a communique is issued which says, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. And here's the killer sentence. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. How do the Russians react? Russia's deputy foreign minister says, Georgia's and Ukraine's membership in the alliance is a huge strategic mistake, which will have most serious consequences for pan-European security. The Russians, after the Bucharest summit, are talking much differently about NATO expansion than they were with regard to the 1999 and 2004 expansions. And that's, of course, because you're marching right up to Russia's doorstep with Ukraine and Georgia being admitted. Putin's response to the Bucharest Declaration is Georgia and Ukraine becoming part of NATO is a direct threat to Russia. This is Putin speaking in 2008. It is no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August of 2008, a few months after the Bucharest summit, you have the Russo-Georgian War. The Georgians, thinking that they're eventually going to join NATO and thinking that countries like the United States will back them, begin to get aggressive in their ambitions vis-a-vis integration into the Western Alliance. What happens is a war breaks out and the Georgians lose and the United States and the West Europeans do nothing to help Georgia. This is the first piece of evidence of what the consequences were going to be of the Bucharest Declaration. Let's talk about the second element of NATO expansion, second element of the Western strategy for dealing with Ukraine, EU expansion. There was a proposed association agreement on the table in 2013. And I'll talk more about this as we go along. This is an association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. The basic name of the game here is not to integrate Ukraine into the EU right away. It's not the game here. It's to start that process with the association agreement. The ultimate aim, of course, is to bring Ukraine into the EU. But the association agreement is to get the ball rolling. The EU has no interest in cooperating with Russia over Ukraine's economic future. This is a very, very important part of the story. Putin actually was not adamantly opposed to the association agreement, provided the Russians were included in the negotiations. Putin said that Russia has deep-seated economic interests in Ukraine. It has powerful economic ties with Ukraine. And if Ukraine is going to negotiate a profoundly important economic agreement with the EU that might eventually lead to integration into the EU, it was imperative that Russia's interests be considered, and therefore that Russia be involved in the negotiations. He made that proposal to the EU, and the EU dismissed it out of hand on more than one occasion. And the Russians were basically told to go packing, and that Ukraine and EU would negotiate this association agreement. Not surprisingly, the Russians saw the EU's actions as a geopolitical threat. This is not simply an economic threat. They saw it as a geopolitical threat. The association agreement, very importantly, contains important geopolitical rhetoric. It's not just about economics. In fact, if you read certain sections of the of the association agreement, it looks like this agreement is a Trojan horse for NATO expansion. So the Russians were very wary about EU expansion. So you see what you have going on here. You have NATO expansion taking place at the same time EU expansion is taking place. And EU expansion not only has significant economic consequences for the Russians, it also is linked to the geopolitical dimension, which is the NATO dimension. Third dimension is fostering an orange revolution. It's important to understand that the US is deeply committed to spreading democracy all around the globe, including in places like Russia. Most of you, I'm sure, heard me talk yesterday about US Middle East policy, and you remember the emphasis that I put on regime change. The United States was deeply committed to regime change in the Middle East. The United States is not only committed to regime change in the Middle East, it's concerned with regime change all over the planet. And it was deeply interested in regime change in Ukraine. The two dimensions of democracy promotion that you want to keep in mind are one, ideological, and two, geopolitical. The United States has an ideological commitment to liberal democracy. Americans believe that liberal democracy is the most favorable political order on the planet. And it would be really good from an ideological point of view if we could spread liberal democracy here, there, and everywhere. At the same time, there's a geopolitical dimension. And the geopolitical dimension goes like this. If we can topple regimes and put democratically elected leaders into power, they will invariably be pro-Western. So when the United States is interested in fostering an orange revolution in Ukraine or a rose revolution in Georgia, it is very important that you understand that they were not just putting someone into power who they couldn't be sure would like the United States or like Russia. They were putting in someone in power who they were quite confident would be pro-American. That's why we like democracy. And the underlying assumption, of course, is that one liberal Democrat's going to like another liberal Democrat. This is the argument that underpins democratic peace theory. Sometimes, as you know, the United States ends up dealing with a liberal democracy or a democracy that has a leader in charge who doesn't like the United States. And you know what the United States does in those cases? We overthrow the leader, even though he's democratically elected. We have a rich history of that. 1953 in Iran, 1954 in Guatemala, 1973 in Chile. I could go on and on. The United States has a rich history of overthrowing democratically elected leaders, because if those leaders don't dance to our tune, you're out of here. But our basic assumption is that we can put people in power through elections who'll be pro-American. So when you start talking about what we were doing in Ukraine, we were trying to foster democracy and put in power pro-American leaders. That's what the Orange Revolution is all about. Okay. There's the deep cause. Three elements: NATO expansion, EU expansion, and fostering an Orange Revolution. Causes the conflict in my view. I'm back to the basic architecture. I've given you the deep cause. Now we want to talk about the precipitating cause. The deep cause does not tell you why the crisis broke out in February of 2014. February 22nd, 2014. Why did it break out in February of 2014? What happened to cause the crisis at that particular point in time? Again, the deep cause can't tell you that story. So we want to talk about the precipitating cause, and then we'll go to the Russian response. The precipitating causes, it's a pretty simple story. The Ukrainian president at the time, this is Yanukovych, rejected an agreement with the EU. This is the association agreement that was being worked out. He rejected it in November 2013. And lots of people in Ukraine were outraged. And that led to demonstrations on the Maidan. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, but over time those demonstrations escalated. And then on February 22nd, 2014, this is a few months after the trouble starts in late November 2013, a coup takes place in Kiev, and Yanukovych is basically overthrown, and he leaves for Russia. That's the precipitating causes. Let me now lay out the story in more detail. November 21st is when Yanukovych says no to the EU deal. December 1st, a couple weeks later, large demonstrations start on the Maidan. December 17th, Putin announces a $15 billion loan to Ukraine, which Yanukovych accepts. See, what's happening here is Putin is offering Ukraine a better deal. The Putin deal is a better deal. And number two, Putin is putting extensive pressure on Yanukovych not to accept the association agreement. And he, of course, on November 21st, rejects it. So Yanukovych rejects it. Putin offers him a better deal. But already the protests have started. Yanukovych and his forces cracked down harshly on the protesters, which I believe was a major mistake, and the situation begins to escalate. On January 22nd, you have the first 2 deaths in the protests. On February 18th, it's about a month later, street clashes leave 26 dead. February 20th, street clashes leave 40 dead. Then on February 21st, this is very important, a number of foreign ministers from Europe, from Germany, Poland, and France, go to Ukraine and they work out a deal that will basically lead to early elections. And that will allow Yanukovych to leave office with face. Okay? In other words, by February 21st, it's clear to the Poles, the Americans, the Germans, and the French that Yanukovych is in deep trouble and that they have to get him out of there. So they cook up a deal on February 21st for early elections, all designed to get rid of Yanukovych. But the protesters reject the deal. Very important to understand this. The protesters reject the deal. And there is increased violence as the protesters occupy buildings, as shooting continues, and Yanukovych, fearing for his life, flees the country. And that's when the trouble begins. Key events after the coup. On February 23rd, this is the Ukrainian parliament. It votes to repeal minority language laws. Almost everybody agrees this was a huge mistake on the part of the new government or the new leadership in Kiev, because it greatly alienated the Russian speakers in the country, and there were many of them. Then on February 27th, Russian units begin seizing checkpoints in Crimea. It's very important, by the way, to understand that the Russians actually had sizable forces in Crimea because they had a lease for the naval base at Sevastopol. The Russians were allowed by treaty to have up to 25,000 troops in the Crimea. This is before the crisis broke out. So the Russians were already there. February 27, Russian units begin seizing checkpoints. February 28th, additional Russian forces, these are forces from Russia itself, begin moving into Crimea. March 6th, the Crimean parliament votes to join Russia and to hold a referendum, which is held on March 16th. You all know the results of the referendum. And on March 18th, Russia incorporates Crimea. You see what happened there? It all started with the association agreement in November of 2013. Conflict then broke out in the Maidan demonstrations, which led to the coup on February 22nd, which led to the Russians taking Crimea. Now, let's talk a little bit about the Russian response. What is it? I believe that the Russian response to the crisis is twofold. Number one, to take Crimea. I think that the Russians took Crimea largely for strategic reasons. I think that the Russians understood they had a naval base there. It was a strategically important piece of real estate on the Black Sea. It made really good sense from a Russian point of view to control that territory or to basically own that territory. And given that the majority of the population was in favor of joining Russia and leaving Ukraine, it was kind of a no-brainer. That's the first step that the Russians took. The second step is that they have gone to great lengths to basically tell the Ukrainians that they have two choices. One is they can cease and desist from trying to join the West, in which case the Russians will pretty much leave them alone, or Ukraine can continue to push for joining the West, in which case the Russians will go to great lengths to wreck Ukraine. And I believe that the Russians are in the process of wrecking Ukraine. And they're in the process of wrecking Ukraine because they don't want Ukraine to join NATO. They don't want Ukraine to join the West. Lots of people like to say that what the Russians have in Ukraine is a frozen conflict. I think to some extent it is a frozen conflict, but I think it's much more than a frozen conflict. I think the Russians are fully aware that as they tighten the vice on the Ukrainians, it's doing increasingly greater damage to the Ukrainian economy, which is in big trouble to begin with, and it's exacerbating those political cleavages that already exist in Ukraine and are a potential source of enormous trouble. So as long as the Russians are involved in eastern Ukraine, they're in a position where they can do really serious damage to the Ukrainian body politic. And the point I'm making to you is they are doing that because that is their way of signaling to Ukraine, you cannot become part of the West. That is unacceptable to us. So that's the basic policy of the Russians in the wake of what happened on February 22nd. The question is, what motivates it? What motivates it is that Ukraine is a core vital interest of Russia, as is Georgia, although I would argue that Ukraine is even more important. It is a large chunk of real estate right on Russia's border that separates it from Poland and Germany. It's a piece of real estate that the Russians cannot afford to allow the West to dominate. You want to understand here that NATO was a mortal foe of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And Russia is basically the replacement for the Soviet Union. The idea that Russia is going to tolerate a situation where NATO, with the United States in charge, marches right up to its border is simply unthinkable. This is not the way international politics works. Great powers care greatly about the security of their neighborhood. Great powers do not like for 1 second the idea of a distant great power marching up to their borders. Many of you probably don't know this, but in the Western Hemisphere, which the United States dominates, we have what's called the Monroe Doctrine. You know what the Monroe Doctrine basically says? It says, we own the Western Hemisphere, and no distant great power is allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. And heaven forbid, no distant great power is allowed to form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere. All of you are too young to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1963, but the Soviet Union had the audacity to put missiles in Cuba. It drove the United States stark raving crazy. Who are these people to come into the Western Hemisphere? This is our neighborhood. Don't they know about the Monroe Doctrine? The Soviets are not allowed to put missiles in Cuba. And then after that, the Soviets talked about building a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. The United States told the Soviets in no uncertain terms, that's unacceptable. We do not like other great powers on our borders. This is hardly surprising. This is geopolitics 101. Well, I want to ask you, if the United States doesn't like great powers in its neighborhood, why should the Soviets or the Russians like great powers in its neighborhood? They shouldn't. It's hardly surprising. Hardly surprising. As my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can have a Monroe Doctrine, and we don't want distant great powers in our backyard, why shouldn't the same logic apply to Russia? And of course it does apply to Russia. Was it surprising? The Russian response? Actually, the United States, President Obama in particular, and the Western leaders were caught completely off guard by what happened. It's really quite remarkable. They were completely surprised that the crisis broke out. This is after the Russians told the Western leaders on numerous occasions that it was unacceptable to try to move Ukraine and Georgia into the West's orbit. This is after you had a war in August of 2008 over Georgia. And we were still surprised. This is a world in which the United States has the Monroe Doctrine, and it has had it since 1823. And doesn't understand that moving NATO, the European Union, right up to Russia's doorsteps and promoting regime change in Ukraine and actually threatening regime change in Russia? I could go into that in the Q&A if anybody wants. We were threatening regime change in Russia as well. You don't think that's going to spook the Russians? Anybody who doesn't understand that doesn't understand geopolitics 101. This brings me to the next point. Why was the West surprised? The West was surprised because the two sides were playing according to different playbooks. The United States was thinking about NATO expansion, EU expansion, in a fundamentally different way than the Russians were. The Russians had a very realist view of what was going on. The Russians were deeply concerned about their security, and they saw NATO expansion and EU expansion and the Orange Revolution as a threat to their survival, as a threat to their security. And they made that clear to the West. This is geopolitics 101, as I've said on a number of occasions already. The West was not thinking in geopolitical terms. The point I'm going to make to you now is of enormous importance. You want to understand that the West was not moving toward Ukraine and toward Georgia for the purposes of containing Russia. There's no evidence that the Russians were thinking about taking Crimea back. Do you understand that? There's no evidence the Russians were thinking about taking Crimea back. There's no evidence that they were building the military forces to invade any country in Eastern Europe. In fact, when you look at the deployment of Russian forces in the western districts of Russia in February 2014, what's striking is how few military units are there and how incompetent they are. And all sorts of American policymakers will tell you that they told the Russians that NATO expansion was not directed at containing them. This was not a realist response. This was not the Cold War where NATO was built to contain the Soviet Union. We were not trying to contain Russia before February 22nd, 2014, when the crisis broke out, because there was no reason to try to contain Russia. Because there was, again, no evidence that Russia was thinking or acting in ways that looked like it was going to move westward. It's very important to understand that. The reason we were moving NATO eastward was we thought that we had this giant liberal security community in Western Europe that we needed to expand further and further. What we needed to do was spread democracy, spread our institutions, NATO and the EU, spread democracy, Orange Revolution, get these countries hooked on capitalism. That's what we were thinking. That's why we were shocked. That's why we in the West were shocked when this crisis broke out. John Kerry, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton have said that realism is an antiquated way of thinking about the world. It's what people thought in the 17th and 18th century. It's not what modern men and women think about. We live in a new world. This is the way they were thinking. And of course, Vladimir Putin and the Russians were thinking in completely different terms. By the way, the Chinese think in the same terms that the Russians think. They act in a very realpolitik way. So the end result is you had these two sides acting according to different playbooks. That's why we were surprised. But again, my point is we should not have been surprised. All right, let's talk about the conventional wisdom. I've given you John's view on the causes of the crisis. Let's talk about the conventional wisdom. First, Vladimir Putin is the main cause. Second, some people hint that he's crazy or irrational. There have even been hints that he bears marked resemblance to Hitler. And then there's the argument that he's bent on creating a greater Russia. Let me say a little bit about each of these. First of all, Putin is not the main cause. The West is the main cause. I want to see somebody provide the evidence that shows that Putin was driving the train before February 22nd, 2014. The idea that he's crazy or irrational, in fact, he's behaved in a very strategic fashion. He's behaved very rationally. I think there's no evidence that he's behaved in a foolish way. Many people argued at the start of the crisis that he was acting foolishly, and the evidence of that is that he'd ultimately end up with egg all over his face, that Russian policy would fail. Now, if anything, people are irate that Putin has been so successful at dealing with the West over the Ukraine crisis. So I think the argument that he's irrational or crazy cannot be supported by any evidence. The argument that he bears marked resemblance or even some small resemblance to Hitler is laughable, right? It's a laughable argument. Anybody who makes that argument knows nothing about Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was one of the greatest mass murderers of all time. Vladimir Putin bears zero resemblance to Adolf Hitler. The argument that he's bent on creating a greater Russia, remember, as I said to you before, there is no evidence that he was doing any such thing or thinking about doing any such thing before February 22nd, 2014. That was a story that we invented That was a story we invented after the crisis broke out. Furthermore, he does not have the capability to conquer huge chunks of territory in Eastern Europe and reestablish the former Soviet Union or create a greater Russia. Russia is a declining great power. It does not have that much military might. This is a country that has a smaller gross national product than Italy. The idea that Russia is the second coming of the Soviet Union and has enough armored division equivalents to overrun Eastern Europe is laughable. So what I'm telling you here is, not only is there no evidence that Putin was bent on creating a greater Russia, he can't do it. In fact, if you want to do anything to wreck Russia today, what you should do is encourage it to invade Ukraine. See how well that goes. You know how the United States is very good at invading countries, and then once the United States owns those countries, it runs into all sorts of problems. Soviets did this in Afghanistan. They had little trouble overrunning Afghanistan. Then once they owned it, everything went south. That's the same thing that would happen in Ukraine. The Russians could easily overrun Ukraine. But what would be the end result? They'd own it, and they'd be in a giant quagmire. Putin understands this for sure, and therefore he's not going to do it. I told you what Putin is doing in Ukraine. Causes of the conflict, conventional wisdom, second slide. Here we get the argument that the United States is a benign hegemon seeking to promote European stability, and Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward to try including Ukraine and Georgia. The argument that the United States is a benign hegemon is part of the liberal story. Again, when the United States moved NATO eastward, up toward Ukraine and Georgia, it believed that it was not threatening the Russians because it is run by a benign hegemon, the United States of America. It's a liberal hegemon. What we were doing was spreading this liberal security community eastward. And we were doing it in a very benign fashion. And that, of course, is why we were surprised. But again, from a Russian point of view, the United States does not look like a benign hegemon. I've had this argument with Michael McFaul, who is the ambassador to Russia between 2012 and 2014, where he says that when he was the ambassador, he talked to President Putin on a number of occasions and told him that NATO expansion was not designed to threaten Russia, and in fact that the Russians shouldn't worry about it at all. But of course he said, when I asked him how Putin responded, that Putin rejected that argument. And McFaul tried on more than one occasion to convince Putin and his lieutenants that the United States was a benign force and that NATO expansion had benign intentions behind it. But he could not convince Putin of that. And of course, as you all understand, it's not what Mike McFaul or Barack Obama thinks that counts. What counts is what Vladimir Putin thinks and his lieutenants. And Putin and his lieutenants did not see the United States as a benign hegemon because they were not playing by the liberal playbook. They were playing by a realist playbook. Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward to try including Ukraine and Georgia. Again, there is no evidence that Putin or Russia needed to be contained. Let's switch gears now and talk about the West's response, at least so far. The West's response has been to double down. What we decided was that Putin had to be the bad guy, and we had to concoct a story that portrayed Russia as being principally responsible for this crisis. You understand, what I'm saying here is that the Americans caused the crisis. There's no way the United States and its European allies could admit that they caused the crisis. They couldn't admit that. They had to blame the Russians. So what they did was they concocted a story about Putin. That is the conventional wisdom, and that's what I'm trying to knock down. And again, what is the conventional wisdom today? The conventional wisdom is that Putin has highly aggressive intentions, he has substantial military forces, and what you're seeing in Ukraine is just the beginning. That's the conventional wisdom. And of course, once you start spinning that conventional wisdom, you have no choice but to double down. Move forces into Eastern Europe, make NATO stronger, have military exercise right in the Russians' faces. This is really great. Of course, we now have poisonous relations, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But the basic strategy of the West was to double down. And this is exactly what we should have expected, because there's no way we were going to blame ourselves for the crisis. Barack Obama wasn't going to say, geez, I goofed. I made a big mistake. He was going to say, no, Putin is highly aggressive. I believe the West is playing a losing hand. The idea that we're going to get the Russians to throw up their hands and quit and allow us to incorporate Ukraine and Georgia into NATO or into the West more generally is a pipe dream. Here's the basic reason why. Ukraine is a core strategic interest for Russia. It's a vital strategic interest. Ukraine is not a core strategic interest for the United States or for the West more generally. When the crisis broke out and the Russians became involved in eastern Ukraine, the United States was unwilling to go to war over Ukraine. In August 2008, the United States was unwilling to go to war over Georgia. What that says is that for the United States, neither Georgia nor Ukraine are vital strategic interests. For Russia, those two countries are vital strategic interests. That means that the balance of resolve in a crisis, like the one we have now, favors the Russians over the Americans by a large margin. That's another way of saying you can inflict massive punishment on Russia and the Russians will not throw up their hands. The reason the Russians will not throw up their hands is that Ukraine is a vital strategic interest. And the idea that they would allow the West to take Ukraine and integrate it into the Western orbit and pull it away from Russia is just not going to happen. So we in the West can inflict as much pain as we want on the Russians, and I believe it won't matter. The Russians will absorb the pain because you're dealing with a vital strategic interest. Let's assume that I'm wrong. Let's assume that we're successful. Let's assume that the West backs the Russians into a corner, that Putin is desperate. Is this good? You think it's good to take a great power that has thousands of nuclear weapons and back it into a corner? You think it's really good to make the Russians scared? You think you want to threaten their security in a profound way? You think you want to threaten their survival? I don't. I think you want to be really careful. I think what's really amazing here is that Ukraine and Georgia are not vital strategic interests for the United States. They're not core strategic interests. Yet we're willing to get really rough with the Russians. I think it's a very dangerous game. But again, my point is we're playing a losing hand. So I don't think we're going to reach the juncture where the Russians are desperate. But if I'm wrong and the Russians are desperate and they have nuclear weapons, I'd be very, very nervous. Let me conclude with some comments about what should be done. My view, as many of you know, is that the central aim should be to create a neutral Ukraine, which is a buffer state between NATO and Russia. A lot of people say, this would never work, how could you do this? I point out to people that between 1992 and 2014, Ukraine was basically neutral, and it was a buffer state. There was no problem over Ukraine in the year 2000. Just go back to the year 2000. What did Ukraine look like? Was Ukraine part of the West? No. In 2000, was Ukraine part of the Russian security alliance? No. It was basically a neutral state. It was a buffer state between NATO and Russia. So you can imagine doing that again. Remember my little chart that I began with? How to think about European security. There's NATO, France, Germany, and Poland. There's Ukraine, there's Russia. This is the situation that you want. You want Ukraine as a neutral buffer state. This is the situation you don't want. Russia has eastern Ukraine, NATO has western Ukraine. They're eyeball to eyeball on the Dnieper River. This would not be good. This would not be good, right? Much better to have a neutral Ukraine. What specifically should be done? Explicitly abandon NATO expansion. Most people will tell you that NATO expansion is off the table. Not going to happen. But the West can't admit that publicly. It would be very helpful if the West explicitly abandoned NATO expansion. Second, fashion an economic rescue plan for Ukraine with Russia, the IMF, and the EU. Remember what I told you early on. I told you that Putin approached the EU in 2015 and made it clear that it was not adamantly opposed to the association agreement, but that it, Russia, wanted to work with the EU to make sure Russia's interests were protected. Bring the Americans in, bring the IMF in, and the EU, and the Russians, and the Ukrainians, and you can fashion a plan to resuscitate the Ukrainian economy. You all understand that Russia has a vested interest in an economically viable Ukraine. Russia does not have an interest in seeing the Ukrainian economy implode because Russia has deep-seated economic interests in Ukraine. And if Ukraine flourished, that would be good for Russia. So as long as Ukraine is a neutral state, not in NATO, you can do all sorts of things on the economic front that would be good for Ukraine, good for Russia, good for the EU. Third, you want to guarantee minority rights, especially language rights in Ukraine. Remember, I told you one of the most foolish things that the new government did, or parliament did in Ukraine right after the coup, was basically outlaw speaking of the Russian language. Huge mistake. And then finally, the Donbass region is going to have to be given meaningful autonomy. This is the way out. There's no other alternative. Okay, consequences. Will there be a new Cold War? What are the implications for NATO? What are the implications for Syria? Is Crimea lost to Russia for good? And what are the implications for Ukraine? Will there be a new Cold War? No. Notice that I'm using Cold War with a capital C and a capital W. The Cold War was an intense security competition between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is gone. The United States is the lone superpower on the planet. I believe that Russia is reemerging as a great power, and I believe that China is probably the second most powerful state in the system at this point in time. And I believe you now have three great powers, China, Russia, and the United States. And in that context, it's hard to see what's happening as a new Cold War, right? Soviet Union is gone. Furthermore, the Russia that has replaced the Soviet Union, as I said before, does not have a lot of offensive military capability. The Soviet Union had a lot of offensive military capability. It was a formidable military force, certainly for the first 2/3, 3/4 of the Cold War. Russia does not have that kind of capability and is not likely to have it over the foreseeable future. So I believe you may have a Cold War with a little c and a little w between Russia and the United States, but you're not going to have anything approximating the first Cold War. What are the implications for NATO? Actually, this crisis has given NATO a new life. You all understand that the United States, starting in 2011, was talking about pivoting to Asia. And as I like to say, when you pivot to Asia, that means you're pivoting away from another place. The place we were pivoting away from was Europe. And the Europeans, before 2014, were desperately afraid that we were going to leave them in the lurch. They did not want the American military to completely leave Europe. Well, now, if anything, the American commitment to Europe has been strengthened because of the Ukraine crisis and because the Americans see the need to double down, which means moving NATO military capabilities further east than has ever been the case before. So in a very important way, NATO has been given a new life by this crisis. But the pivot to Asia has been threatened by this crisis. What are the implications for Syria? I think quite significant. I think that for the Syrian crisis to be shut down, it's absolutely essential that the United States and the Russians work together. I think it's almost impossible for the Americans to work with the Syrians because we have poisonous relations, and the principal reason that we have poisonous relations is the Ukraine crisis. I think what you see going on with regard to US-Russian relations over Syria is spillover from the Ukraine crisis. So I think for Syria, the Ukraine crisis has had really negative consequences. Is Crimea lost to Russia for good? I'll answer this question with one word: yes. What are the implications for Ukraine? This is a very important question. I want to elaborate on this. As I told you before, what's happening here is that Ukraine continues to be interested in joining the West. Ukraine would like to become part of NATO, would like to become part of the EU, would like to become part of the West. This is an absolute no-no for the Russians. And the way the Russians are trying to prevent it is by going to great lengths to wreck Ukraine. They're trying to wreck Ukraine not because they want to conquer Ukraine or because the Russians are naturally aggressive. They're trying to wreck Ukraine because they want to prevent it from becoming part of the West. Some evidence of that. Here's Ukrainian per capita GDP. 2013, $3,900. $3,900. 2015, $1,600. Overall, Ukrainian GDP shrunk by 6.8% in 2014. Remember, the crisis breaks out February 22nd, 2014. Overall, Ukrainian GDP shrinks by 6.8% in 2014. It shrunk by 15% in 2015. If you do some Googling and you look at what's happening to the Ukrainian economy today, it's quite clear that it's in free fall. It's quite clear that this is having all sorts of negative consequences for Ukraine. Who is anti-Ukrainian? I've given this talk a number of times. And in fact, when I gave it at Chatham House, I was involved in a debate involving Michael McFaul, Roger Cohen of the New York Times, Dmitry Trenin from here. There were a number of Ukrainian women, 3 Ukrainian women in the audience who listened to the talk, listened to the debate. And indeed, one of them asked me a question from the floor. But afterwards, we had a reception at Chatham House. And these 3 women, again, all Ukrainian, came up to me. And it was clear that they were enraged by my comments. And I, of course, was making a set of arguments that bear marked resemblance to what I've said here tonight. They were just enraged by what I said. And their view was that I was deeply hostile to Ukraine. And they could not understand why I hated Ukraine. And I told them, I thought that they were dead wrong. I said, in no way am I anti-Ukrainian. I said, my argument is that it is the West that has led Ukraine down the primrose path. It's the West that told Ukraine and told Georgia that they should become part of NATO, they should become part of the EU, and that caused this crisis. And that the West continues to hint, if not occasionally tell the Ukrainians that they can become part of the West. This is delusional, because they can't become part of the West. The Russians will go to great lengths for good strategic reasons to wreck Ukraine before they let that happen. And I just showed you the figures that provide some evidence that that's exactly what's happening here. So what needs to be done is Ukraine needs to stop talking and thinking about joining the West and instead move to create a neutral buffer state and move to improve its relations with the Russians for Ukraine's own good. Ukraine needs to stop listening to the United States, because the United States, again, and its European allies are principally responsible for causing this mess and exacerbating this mess. And the idea that someone like me is anti-Ukrainian is fundamentally wrong. I'm not anti-Ukrainian, and the best way to solve this problem for the Ukrainian people is to adopt the policy that I laid out here and to abandon the present policy that they're pursuing, largely egged on by the West. What are the prospects for ending this crisis? I'd say, given how poisoned relations are between Russia and the West, and given the present situation in Ukraine itself, the prospects for ending the crisis are somewhere between bleak and hopeless. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. I see there's one microphone right there and a young woman standing there.
First of all, thank you very much. I wish you work in the Obama administration. My name is Svetlana Vorobyova. I'm a second-year master student. First of all, sorry, because my question is not about the Ukraine crisis. But considering you're here, so if world politics comprises independent political states that have no central authority above them, and global governance is impossible to be established, what are the tangible means of challenging climate change? How to make all actors, including political, economic, and non-financial units, to contribute to the environmental protection and reclaim? So in other words, what can be a substitute for a goodwill in regard to environmental protection? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I can't answer that question because I don't have an opinion on it. It's very rare for me to say I don't have an opinion on a particular subject. As some of you probably know, I have an opinion on almost every subject having to do with international politics. But when it comes to the environment, I've just not studied it, and I've not figured out in my head what I think on those sorts of issues. So I apologize, but I can't help you.
My name is Fatima Tamarova. I'm working for We Build Europe, and I have got a question in the framework of security dilemma. You said that great power are interested in security of their neighborhoods, but we see that Eastern Partnership is in a deep crisis. And Arseniy Sivitsky, he is an expert from Belarus, he described new Russian strategy as a strategy to gain power and hegemony by destabilizing the region, and in fact, Russia is interested in creating different kinds of frozen conflicts. Donetsk, in fact, is an instrument of pressure on Kyiv, because we see that Russia is not interested in recognizing Donetsk National Republic. And however, Russia was involved in several conflicts, like Transnistria, like South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and now it's Donetsk National Republic. And that's why NATO, they adopt a hybrid strategy, and they described conflict in Ukraine as a hybrid conflict. European Union Commission adopted the joint framework on hybrid conflicts.
You should make your question shorter.
So, just I wanted to ask you, who can solve the problem of security in Eastern Partnership? Because I can't see the Russian possibility as a great power to make Eastern Partnership or the Eurasian region more stable.
Look, when you talked about Russian behavior,
Yes.
you focused in good part on Georgia and on Ukraine.
Not only, but also on Transnistria and
Okay,
other.
let me finish. I let you talk, you let me talk. You focused in good part on Georgia and Ukraine. The point that I made to you in this talk is that up until April 2008, when NATO said that it was going to eventually bring Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, there was no problem with the Russians regarding both Georgia and regarding Ukraine. That was when the trouble really began, okay? And what I'm saying to you is that if you are from a small country and you live next door to a guerrilla, you have to be very careful, right? This is what I'm saying. If you live in Cuba, or you live in Canada, or you live in Mexico, you live next door to the mightiest great power on the planet. And you have to be very careful you don't make that great power scared and angry. The Cubans did that, and they paid a god-awful price for it, right? The same thing applies to Eastern Europe. You should understand that the Russians are very powerful relative to their neighbors. And the United States is not going to pull Georgia or Ukraine's chestnuts out of the fire. Therefore, they have to go to great lengths to be very careful in terms of dealing with their Russian
So there is
neighbor.
no choice for Ukraine.
There is no choice, that's right. And I just want to say one more point on this. A question I often get is that people say, Ukraine is a sovereign state, and therefore Ukraine has a right to choose its own foreign policy. I say this is a foolish way of thinking about international politics. Ukraine doesn't have a right to choose its foreign policy. When you live next door to Russia, you don't have a right to choose your foreign policy. You think Cuba had a right to choose whoever it wanted to ally with? Of course it doesn't. Let me ask you a question. If in 25 years, China is really powerful, and it decides to form a military alliance with Canada and Mexico, do you think that the United States believes that Canada and Mexico have a right to form an alliance with China? I can guarantee you we will not think for 1 second that they have a right. It's delusional to tell the Ukrainians that they have a right to choose whatever foreign policy they want. They don't have a right. And if they act like they have a right, they're going to end up getting their country destroyed. And again, I think this is not good for Ukraine.
Good evening, Mr. Mearsheimer. Thank you for delivering such an interesting lecture today. My question is, taking into account what has been done in Ukraine during the last few years, what do you think about the role of Belarus in the dialogue between NATO and Russia in the future?
What do I think of the role of what?
Of Belarus. Belarus.
Belarus?
Belarusia, yeah, maybe.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just...
Because now there's a tendency to call it Belarus instead of Belarusia, you know?
Well, I think it's quite clear that the Belarusians have been playing their cards correctly. The Belarusians have no interest in joining NATO and becoming part of the West. Isn't that correct? Nobody's seen any evidence of that. And look at the situation in Belarus today. You don't see the Russians causing trouble there. You see the Russians causing trouble in Ukraine, and that's because Ukraine wants to become part of the West. So if anything, what should happen here is the Ukrainians should imitate the Belarusians.
Mr. Mearsheimer, I wanted to clarify one aspect in your lecture. When you were speaking about Ukraine joining Western structures such as NATO and EU, do you really think that Ukraine is going to become a true member of NATO or EU, or just associate kind of?
I don't think that that Ukraine is now going to become part of NATO or the EU. I think that's off the table for sure. And I don't think that Ukraine is going to become an associate member of either one of those organizations either. The point that I tried to make here is I think it would be a good idea if the United States explicitly took NATO expansion into Ukraine and Georgia off the table. That's not going to happen, but I think it would be a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Mearsheimer, for your tremendously interesting talk. And I have two questions, one theoretical and one more practical. So one concerns your theory. If we assume that states are rational actors in the anarchical system, how can we explain the fact that their policies are often driven by irrational factors like unrealistic ideology, for example, or public opinion?
Okay, this is a great question. I have a theory of international politics, and that theory of international politics is a simplification of reality. The world is a remarkably complicated place, and any theory that a person comes up with is a simplification of that complexity. That means that in devising a theory, you leave a number of factors on the cutting room floor that sometimes matter in international politics, okay? This is why I say, if a theory can explain 75% of the cases that it applies to, that theory gets a position in the Hall of Fame. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that if a theory is right 75% of the time, you're in the Hall of Fame. That means the theory is wrong. This is a Hall of Fame theory, is wrong 25% of the time. And again, the reason that the theory is wrong 25% of the time is that you leave certain factors on the cutting room floor for the purposes of simplification, and those factors matter. And in my story, domestic politics, as you know, things like public opinion, to use your language, get left on the cutting room floor. And occasionally, they jump up and bite you in the hiney. And that's why my theory is sometimes wrong.
Good evening, Professor Mearsheimer. Thank you very much for these amazing lectures. And I have two quick questions. First of all, it's your first time in Russia, and what is Russia for you, and did Russia meet your expectations? And the second one, in the foreseeable future, do you see any possibilities to create security system from Vancouver to Vladivostok? Thank you.
What was the question? Do I see any possibility of creating a security system?
From Vancouver to Vladivostok.
Yes.
The common security system.
Okay. Yes, this is actually my first time in Russia, which is hard to believe. I've been invited probably about 10 times in the past, but for a variety of reasons, I just couldn't come. And this was the first time all the stars were lined up and I was able to come. I regret that I didn't come earlier, and I hope to come more times in the future. With regard to your second question, do I think it's possible to come up with a security system that spans from Vancouver to Vladivostok? And the answer to that is no. I don't believe in security systems that are designed by states to produce peace. I don't believe that they ever work. I believe that states are independent actors that pursue their own selfish interests. I believe that the Russians, the Americans, and the Chinese, to take the three most powerful states in the world today, all pursue their own selfish interests. And sometimes that leads them to cooperate, and sometimes that leads them to compete and even fight with each other. But the idea that the three of them could get together and sit down and devise a security system that all three of them agreed to is not the way international politics works. They're all too selfish for that to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Mearsheimer, for a very wise presentation. I think that you really understand Russian point of view. My question will be the next. If Western political leaders would not be so wise and try to increase pressure on Russia, what do you expect from Russia if Russia stays on realistic positions in the future? And I guess we would stay because we are not going to change our political leader in the near future. What do you expect Russia should do and would do?
Well, I think that if the West continues to maintain its present policies, the Russians are not going to throw up their hands and surrender on Ukraine. I think if the West continues to double down on Ukraine, the Russians will continue to squeeze the Ukrainians and inflict massive pain on Ukraine. Now, it may be the case that the West will respond with more sanctions against Russia, but again, my point is that will not bring the Russians to throw up their hands and surrender. So I think the Russians are in this for the long term, and I think that they'll do everything they can to thwart NATO's and the United States' ambitions to incorporate Ukraine into NATO. I think with regard to Syria, the Russians will go to great lengths to make sure that the Assad government remains in power. And I think that it'll be very hard for the Americans at this point in time or in the near future to do anything to get rid of Assad. So I think the Russians will end up getting their way on Syria, and I think ultimately they'll get their way on Ukraine as well. As I said in my talk, if I'm wrong and the West, in particular the United States, is able to put really great pressure on the Russians and back them into a corner, and threaten the survival of the Putin regime, I think we are in effect asking for trouble because because Russia has nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mearsheimer, for your speech, and I have two questions. You say that the United States act as a liberal superpower, and what are the main weak points of liberalism? And the second question is, why doesn't modern Russia interfere into the deals between the USA and its neighbors? Thank you.
Our first question is, what are the main weaknesses of liberalism? I'll just point to two of them. One is liberalism places a high premium on social engineering. Liberalism places a high premium on spreading democracy around the world, and that means invading countries and trying to effect regime change, to turn those countries into democracies. That's a prescription for disaster. As I made clear in my talk yesterday on the Middle East, the United States has pursued regime change 5 times in the Middle East, and it's failed in all 5 cases. So one of the principal problems with liberalism, just to repeat, is that it produces a very interventionist policy aimed at regime change, which ultimately fails in almost every case. The second problem with liberalism, and this gets to my Ukraine story, is that when you act according to the liberal playbook, right, and you are dealing with an adversary that is operating according to the realist playbook, you're going to get yourself in a whole heck of a lot of trouble because you basically are not going to understand what motivates your adversary and how your adversary is likely to respond to your moves. And this is what happened in the Ukraine crisis. As I said before, the United States and the West Europeans moved NATO eastward, not for the purposes of containing Russia, but because they thought that they could take this liberal security community and move it further and further eastward. The Russians viewed it in completely different terms. They did not view the United States as a benign hegemon. They viewed it as a threat. We didn't see it that way. And the end result is you have this giant mess today. That's your first question, right? What was the second question?
Why doesn't modern Russia interfere into the deals between the USA and its neighbors?
Because it's too smart to do that. Why would they want to do that? The Russians have their hands full with Ukraine and Georgia and the local neighborhood, and now Syria. Do you think it would make sense for the Russians to interfere in the Western Hemisphere? They tried that in the Cold War, and it didn't work out very well. And the Soviet Union was much more powerful relative to the United States than Russia is relative to the United States today.
Hello, Mr. Mearsheimer. I would like to thank you for such a wonderful lecture. That first of all, and my name is Alexander Chekhov. I am a lecturer here in Moscow State Institute of International Relations, and my question will be the following. You said that that the United States consider itself being so-called benign hegemon. But if United States really consider itself being so, why it was so reluctant when in the 90s, when Russia was seriously considering a possibility of joining NATO? Even during his first term, Vladimir Putin, for example, in 2000, just after he was elected the president, he openly said that Russia is considering a possibility of joining NATO. Why there were no reaction from the US side on these initiatives? Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. I think there are two reasons. First of all, I think the United States has always been reluctant to have Russia join NATO because that would reduce America's influence in the alliance. Whenever you create an institution, the ideal situation is to dominate that institution. The United States dominates NATO today. It's really the most powerful actor in the alliance by far. And what it's done by incorporating the Baltic states, Romania, Hungary, is bring in weaker states. If you brought in Russia, that would markedly reduce American influence. So that's one reason. Second argument is what NATO expansion has really been all about, and I showed this on the map, is a slow but steady march eastward, right? It was Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary in the 1999 tranche, then we talked about the 2004 tranche, and then in 2008 they were talking about Ukraine and Georgia. There are some people who say that after Ukraine and Georgia were incorporated into NATO, there was no reason, had relations not deteriorated, that Russia couldn't have eventually been brought into NATO. And you know, in the early years of the post-Cold War world, it looked like Russia might become part of one whole Europe. But of course, the situation deteriorated over time in ways I described, and that became unthinkable after a certain point.
Thank you. Professor Mearsheimer, thank you so much for your lecture. My name is Irina, and the question is as follows. So you mentioned that the neutrality of Ukraine is a condition for peace in Europe. So the question is, I believe that this neutrality is not that easy to achieve. What are the conditions to ensure the neutrality of Ukraine?
Well, look, I believe it's impossible or almost impossible to achieve. That's how I ended the talk, the prospects for ending the crisis. I think that relations between Ukraine and Russia on one hand, and Russia and the West on the other hand are so poisonous at this point in time that it's hard to imagine how you could fashion an agreement similar to the one that I put up here today. That's point one. Point two is, I made the argument that if you look at Ukraine's status in Europe between 1992 and 2014, it was effectively an independent buffer state. It was not part of the West, and in fact, the West was interested in making it part of the West. And it was not part of any any Russian alliance structure. So why can't we go back to that situation? It existed before. And the reason we can't go back is because this crisis has so thoroughly damaged relations between Ukraine and Russia and the West that it's hard to see how we can move back in that direction.
Thank you.
Thank you for the inspiring lecture. My name is Jessie. My question is, after the surprising lessons learned from Ukrainian crisis about Russia's geopolitical ideologies, what changes in America's treatment of Russia do you expect in the future? Do you think that United States should rethink its strategies on promoting Western ideologies?
Look, let me just tell you what I think the United States should do with regard to Russia. I think that the principal threat that the United States faces in the future is the rise of China. I think China is a potential peer competitor. I think it could be an enormously powerful adversary. I think the reason that Hillary Clinton enunciated the pivot to Asia in 2011 was because she and other people in the Obama administration understood just how much trouble China could cause, and therefore how important it was to start thinking about containing China. In that context, I think Russia is of minor importance as a threat to the United States. Russia is not a serious threat to us, and in fact, I think the United States needs Russia to help contain China down the road. So my view is what the United States should do is should improve its relations with Russia over Ukraine. It should improve its relations with Russia over Ukraine, and we should move to create a neutral buffer state. The United States should work with the Russians in Syria to end that humanitarian disaster, and the United States should work with Russia over the long term to deal with China. I think that Russia and the United States should have cooperative relations for the most part over time. But the question you have to ask yourself, and I have to ask, is how likely is that? And the answer is extremely unlikely, at least in the foreseeable future. I think the United States is about to elect Hillary Clinton president, and Hillary Clinton is much more hawkish than Barack Obama, number one, and she is more hostile to the Russians than Barack Obama. So I think there's little prospect of things improving anytime soon because Hillary Clinton will be the next president.
Thank you, dear Mr. Mearsheimer, for your lecture. My name is Irina. I'm from Prague, studying University of Economics, and my question is about the recent development of Ukrainian crisis. As we all know, a few days ago, the Normandy format was met together, and they discussed the possibility of the deployment of military forces of OSCE in the eastern part of Ukraine. And my question is about how do you think, if it's possible, that the deployment of the military forces can lead to the further crisis between Russia and the West? And if yes, can you a bit cooperate?
I think if the Russians and the Ukrainians both agree to the deployment of OSCE forces, then there shouldn't be any problem. If the Russians are opposed or the Ukrainians are opposed to putting OSCE forces in there, they're not going to go in. But if the Russians and the Ukrainians both decide they have a vested interest in accepting these forces, then they'll go in. The question you have to ask yourself is, does that solve the problem? And the answer is no. because the problem's only going to be solved when two things happen. One, when the Donbass region is given significant autonomy, and number two, when the Ukrainians regain control of the entire border that they share with Russia. Those two things have to happen. And the likelihood that Ukraine is going to agree to give more autonomy or significant autonomy to the Donbass region is close to zero. So this one is not going to be solved anytime soon. I hope I'm wrong on that one. I hope we read in the paper a week from now that they've reached a way of settling those political problems, but I would not bet much money on it. I think we're in real trouble. So my point to you about the OSCE troops is they may help somewhat, but they're just a Band-Aid. They don't deal with the fundamental political problems that have to be addressed.
Yeah, good evening, Professor Mearsheimer. My name is Dennis. I'm second-year master student in international relations. So I'm going to ask you a little bit provocative question, if I may. So, like in 1993, you wrote an article in Foreign Affairs, which is called "The Case for Ukraine Nuclear Deterrent," where you have basically argued that it is strategically unwise for Ukraine to surrender its nuclear arsenal. So, given that...
Let's take two more, then I'll go. Okay. So, I'm sorry. I wrote this article in 1993 on Ukrainian nuclear weapons.
Yes. So basically, you argue there that it was strategically unwise for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons because it could face a potential Russian aggression. And given that now we're witnessing the rise of hyper-nationalism in Ukraine, and from the perspective of international security, do you still maintain this position? And finally, if Ukraine did in fact have nuclear weapons in 2014, could the Crimea's reunion with Russia ever happen? Thank you.
Yeah. Just to elaborate here, I wrote a piece in 1993 in Foreign Affairs, as this gentleman said, arguing that Ukraine should not give up its nuclear weapons. And of course, the United States gave Ukraine compound fractures of both arms and both legs to force them to give up their nuclear weapons. I do believe that if Ukraine had nuclear weapons in 2014, that they still would have lost Crimea. I think that that still would have happened. But I do not think you would be having the present problem in eastern Ukraine if Ukraine had nuclear weapons. But I can't prove that one way or the other. I'll take two more questions.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening. So the first question, why didn't the USA try to make Ukraine become part of NATO just afterwards the dissolution of the Soviet Union? And the second question...
Could you repeat the first question?
Yeah. Why didn't the USA try to make Ukraine become part of the NATO just afterwards the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Well, her question is, why didn't the United States move to make Ukraine part of NATO right after the Cold War ended, or right after the Soviet Union fell apart? Yeah. I think that the United States took a few years to figure out that it was even interested in NATO expansion. So when the Soviet Union collapses in '92, you don't see any evidence that the United States is seriously thinking about NATO expansion. That begins really in around 1995. That's when the United States begins to think seriously about moving the alliance eastward. And then the first tranche is in '99. So you understand, it's not till 1999 that NATO begins to move. And it does it incrementally. That was my response to one of the earlier questions. It does it incrementally. And Ukraine is way out there. They got to get Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic in first. So there's just no way that it could have been done in 1993 or 1992 or even 1995. It just, thinking about NATO expansion just didn't develop that quickly.
And just the last question. Are you allowed and are you invited to express such point of view concerning Ukraine, Middle East on American principal TV channels?
I think that occasionally I am. I don't think that the mainstream media in the United States is especially interested in hearing my voice, to be honest. I think they'll occasionally let me say some words. I think the mainstream media in the United States has been almost unanimous in promoting the conventional wisdom that I described in my talk today. And the mainstream media in the United States has had remarkably little interest in purveying or giving serious attention to the alternative explanation that people like me and Stephen Cohen and Steve Walt and others have been arguing for a number of years now. This will be the final question.
Wow. Hello, Dr. Mearsheimer, from a graduate of the University of Chicago who came here.
Oh.
I hope you've enjoyed your stay in Russia as much as I have. And my question is pretty simple. What kind of role do you think that members of NATO other than the US might play in deciding NATO and US policy with regards to Russia? And specifically, I'm thinking about the Baltic states and other recent NATO additions, which have been sources, at the very least, of anti-Russian rhetoric, essentially since before the Soviet Union even collapsed.
Yeah, I think with regard to all of the states that were either part of the former Soviet Union or were part of the Warsaw Pact, there is a deep-seated fear of Russia, almost an irrational fear. I think they tend to view Russia as the second coming of the Soviet Union. They think that Russia has aggressive designs on their country, and they want the United States to defend them. I don't blame them. I don't blame these countries for wanting to be part of NATO. The Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Ukraine. I fully understand what their motive is. If I were in their shoes, I'd want the United States to defend me as well. And of course, one of the best ways to get the United States to defend you is to portray Russia as the devil incarnate, and a powerful devil at that. So if you go to Eastern Europe today and you talk to people in those countries about the Russian threat, they engage in what I would call serious threat inflation, okay? And it's easy to understand. However, if you go to places like Germany and you go to places like France, there you'll find that most people have a much more sophisticated understanding of the Russian threat. I think that in a country like Germany, there are really quite a few people who understand the basic logic of my position and who understand that it does not make good sense to antagonize the Russians. If I can just back up for a second. You know the Bucharest Conference. I've talked about the Bucharest Conference at some length. That's the April 2008 conference where NATO said that Ukraine and Georgia would become part of NATO. You noticed when I put the slide up there, I said that that statement was issued in the final communique at the end of the conference. The fact is that in the conference itself, the French, and especially the Germans, and especially Angela Merkel, to her credit, fought tooth and nail to prevent Ukrainian and Georgian accession into NATO, to prevent that from moving forward. Because Merkel understood that that would antagonize the Russians and cause all sorts of problems. So the Germans and the French were not unaware of this problem, unlike the Americans. But the problem with the West Europeans, and this is especially true with the Germans, is they tend to take their marching orders from Washington. they're very reluctant to say no to the United States. And the United States has been the principal force driver behind NATO expansion and behind the efforts to make the EU, or to make Ukraine part of the EU. So the United States has been very successful at getting the West Europeans to dance to its tune. And of course, then you have the East Europeans who, as I said, reinforce all the Americans' negative views of the Russian threat. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out again on a Friday evening, and I enjoyed this thoroughly.